Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 42nd episode of 2022. Before I kick off, I'd like to thank our sponsors for Fiber Breakfast, including our gold sponsors, Graybar and Vetro. The Department of Commerce and NTI have designated October 2022 as Workforce Month, and to spotlight some of the importance of building a diverse and equitable and skilled workforce through the Internet for All program. NTI recently published the Workforce Planning Guide, which you can find on NTI's Broadband USA website. And the Workforce Planning Guide, it cites the Fiber Broadband Association's fiber optic technician training program as a best practice. So thanks, Lucy, for that. And is intended for eligible entities developing submissions for the BEAD program that may also be applicable as entities to develop their digital equity plans. Last Wednesday, the FCC announced the latest RDOF awards to be approved. That brings us just over $6 billion in RDOF award approvals from the $9.2 billion initially awarded the auction way back in, December 2020, December 7th, 2020. But given the FCC's rejection of Starlink and LTD Broadband's RDOF awards that totaled about $2.18 billion, and Starry's default on $269 million, and the other defaults, which are about $220.7 million. So there should be a little over $500 million left in long-form applications in review. On the Fiber Broadband Association front, our next regional Fiber Connect workshop will be in Columbus, Ohio on November 3rd. I had a great prep call with Ohio's broadband director, Peter Vogelberg, yesterday. And if you don't know Peter, he's super high energy and always on. So I'm looking forward to my fireside chat with him in Columbus. So you're not going to want to miss that. Later today at 1 p.m. Eastern, I'll be doing a webinar with my friends at Lightwave on enabling next generation broadband. So join us for that event. Now let's get to today's Fiber for Breakfast. We have the second half of our discussion on whether BEAD is enough. Today's session is titled Millions Left Behind. BEAD isn't enough to close the digital divide, with Larry Thompson, the CEO of Vantage Point Solutions. Larry and Vantage Points are the leading experts on rural broadband. And before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers, my team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank our Fiber for Breakfast Gold sponsors, Graybar and Vetro. Now, if everyone would just keep in mind that you're all in listen mode only. To ask a question, you can simply type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. If you take a minute to do so, we do appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week at Fiber for Breakfast, we discussed fiber to every rural home. BEAD is more than enough with the leading rural broadband expert, Jonathan Chambers of Connexon. Jonathan argued that on average, the cost of deploying fiber to unserved rural America is roughly $2,000 per location, and he cites the FCC's failure in the past as a result of not investing in fiber to every home from the beginning. Today's Fiber for Breakfast session is with Larry Thompson of Vantage Point, who fears that millions left behind. BEAD isn't enough to close the digital divide. Larry, I know this is going to be a fun session because the questions are already starting to load in really fast here. So I've barely introduced you. Larry is the CEO of Vantage Point Solutions, a premier engineering and consulting firm serving the fiber broadband industry. A licensed professional engineer, he's held several engineering and management positions prior to founding Vantage Point in 2002. With over 30 years of experience of designing fiber-based wireless and satellite networks, he's a trusted and respected expert authority on matters related to telecommunications, technology, and regulation. As such, he's a two-term member of the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. He holds a bachelor degree in physics from William Jewell College and a bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering from University of Kansas. So welcome, Larry. And for our audience, keep typing in your questions and we'll get to the Q&A at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Larry.
All right, thanks, Gary. Yeah, I am sporting a beard this morning because I decided not to shave when I was in Uganda the last couple of weeks. So me and some of my team are doing broadband there in a community that makes $1.90 a day. The challenges of broadband in Uganda are much different than in the US. And we're going to talk about the US today. But this has been a hot topic, obviously. You can flip past this. Gary did a good job of introducing me. I don't need to go over that. But one reason why it's really important to understand, is this going to be enough, is I think there's a mentality right now, both at the White House as well as the FCC and Congress, and for those of you that heard the speaker last week, that BEAD is going to finish the job. It's going to be enough. I think that could also lead to some problems if we get into that mentality, because I strongly believe that BEAD is not going to finish the job. Last week, Mr. Chambers, started his presentation by saying that you really need to know two things. I agree with this. You need to know how many locations need broadband and what's the cost to deploy broadband. Those are kind of the key elements. So the white paper I wrote, published about a month ago, I was doing on behalf of the ACAM Broadband Coalition, because they had asked me that same question earlier in the year, and I said, well, I don't know. Let's figure this out. And so really the white paper was really to answer the question, is BEAD going to be enough? And so we really explored those two things. How many people still need broadband, and how much is it going to cost? This just shows several people, NTIA, industry consultants, and government, that really think that it's going to finish closing the digital divide. Next slide. So there's been several studies. I just saw another one come out last week on how much will it really cost to close the digital divide. The results, as you know, are all over the place. Starting with Paul Dessau, who was with the FCC in 2017. He came along and said it was $80 billion back then. We've had Boston Consulting Group, Artesian's done a couple, Tufts University's done some. So there's been a lot of people that have tried to tackle the question, how much is it going to cost to get universal broadband? Most of them missed the mark for a number of reasons. And one big reason is we really don't know how many unserved or underserved locations there are in the US. All we're dealing with is flawed FCC Form 477 data and other sources that are just very high level approximations. So like in my paper and what others have done, we kind of take our best educated guess on the flawed data. One benefit I have, or the more recent reports like mine have, that they didn't have 4 or 5 years ago, is some states now have actually done a very good job of mapping out their served and unserved. And so we can actually go back to see what they found, compare it to the 477 data from the FCC, and do some extrapolations in the other states. And that's really what I did. Next, there we go. But I would say one of the bigger areas is unrealistic costs. And I think you heard that last week as well. People don't really understand what it costs to build broadband in these very rural areas of the US. And if you look across the country now, what's left for BEAD is generally these rural areas. We're not dealing with the large metropolitan areas or even the second tier communities generally. We're looking at these rural areas. It's often price cap territories that have been neglected for years. And they're very rural. It's some of the least dense areas in the United States and some of the hardest to construct areas. It's very difficult also for you to be able to put these kinds of costs into a model and estimate them. A lot of it comes from just experience on the ground. We work in over 40 states. We do over 10,000 miles of construction management per year. Over the last few years, we've done $2.7 billion in grants, awards, and auctions for our clients as well. So we're very familiar with the construction costs across, almost every state in the United States. And the rural factor is big here because the rural areas, the biggest driver for costs is density. And the cost per location, what we see in town areas, or even the denser areas out east, aren't very representative of what it really costs to get into these rural areas. You've got issues when you get into these rural areas with, protected weeds or protected species, environmental issues. You've got counties that have different depth requirements, and you go from one county to another. Those that want you to hand dig around drain tile because they don't want you to just randomly bore under them. Or there's all sorts of things. There's landowners now, a lot of the states, when you get a roadway right away, they don't give you utility easements as well. And so you've got to go to the landowner. Sometimes securing easements alone is more expensive than the engineering work is for doing all of the staking and fielding. So there's a lot of other costs that need to be considered. And one thing to keep in mind too that the recent studies haven't accounted for, because it likely hadn't occurred, is just the significant increase in price that we've seen over these last couple of years. And I think we're going to continue to see over the next coming years. Generally, when we do predictions, we assume 6 to 8% inflation year over year. And that's what we've been seeing the last several years up until these last 2 years. These last 2 years, it's not uncommon to see 25 or 30% inflation. Now, when I was doing my estimates for this paper, I didn't take those enormous inflation rates we've been seeing. I just used the 8%, which is typical, which would be one reason why I think maybe my estimate's even a little bit on the low side, because I think by the time BEAD money rolls out, we're going to see substantially higher construction costs because of both materials and labor increases. So asking that first question, then how many really lack adequate broadband? I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but as you know, on the 477 forms, it really deals with only wholly unserved census blocks, like you see in B there, which the red dots are unserved, yellow, underserved, and green are the served. So really, you look at all of those red dots, all of the ones in the partially served wouldn't be counted as part of the 477 forms. If you look at some of the states like Georgia who've done a good job mapping, it's around 3 times more. If you know how many are in the fully unserved census block, it's about 3 times more than that if you want to also include those that are in the partially served census block. So you can see why there's a big error if you're relying only on 477 if you don't adjust it for the partially served census blocks. So if you look, when I went back, and I was basing this on June 2020, keep that in mind, that was the most current 477 at the time I was developing my report. Now they have June 2021 out, but at that time, there was 5.7 million locations in the fully unserved census blocks, which would imply there's around 18 million unserved locations. And as you recall from the IIJA, unserved is below 25.3. If we want to talk about underserved, which would be those between 25.3 and 100 by 20, it's usually another factor of 2.5 times more. And several people, us, Cartesian Lightbox, a variety of people have confirmed that that's about what we see. And so if you look at the unserved, there's about 27 million then that are underserved, in addition to the 18 million that are unserved. Next slide. So when you look at construction costs, the way I approached it is we had just got done with RDOF, where we did RDOF bidding for around 80 companies in 16 states. You can see the 16 states on the map there, where a fairly large cross section of the country. And like I said, it included 8% inflation per year. By the time I did this report, RDOF construction was already 2 years out, 2 years before that. And I figured we're not going to do any BEAD construction for 2 more years. So I figured 4 years of inflation seemed reasonable. I had calculated on average with a 70% penetration rate that the cost per location in all of those 80 RDOF areas we bid in was around $11,000 per location. When you apply 4 years of inflation at 8%, comes out to $15,000 a location on average. That's the unserved, the below 25.3. So I said, well, the underserved would be less, because if you're getting them 100 meg or close, you've got fiber closer to those customers. It's going to be less than 15. So I said 6 to 9. And so that's how I estimated the cost per location. And there's areas of the country, you can go to the next slide, but there's areas of the country that are substantially more than that we deal with as well. So there's places of the country where it's $400,000 a mile, when we're doing construction, because it's in the Rocky Mountains or it's in the mountains of California. So there's 15,000 per location is not an astronomically high number. It's fairly common in rural areas. We did a layout for one of our clients in Montana. That particular exchange, if it was a state, would be bigger than 2 of our states. It averaged 0.17 customers per square mile. So there's very rural areas out there that are going to be part of this BEAD program. And to think that you can construct those for a couple thousand or 5,000 a location is just not realistic. So if we put my numbers together here, 18.1 million unserved at 15,000, 27.3 million underserved at somewhere in that 6,000 to 9,000 per location range. What you end up with from a total perspective then is somewhere around 400 to 478 billion dollars total to be able to construct that. Now, one thing I will point out is, and you've got to be a little careful about this, is I'm talking about total CapEx construction required. Sometimes when you read these reports or listen to these speakers, they're talking about support needed. This is total CapEx. So obviously there's going to be some end user revenues that you've got to account for, some private investment and things like that. That's going to offset some of this. So I'm not saying you need 400 billion from the government, because some of that could be end user revenues that we that go to offset or capital, some sort of outside capital. This is total construction. This is how much will it cost to build. Next slide. So some of the questions, I know we've got a few in advance, and I kind of scanned some of those, and just some of the questions I've had. I've presented this to the FCC and others. Some of the things I ask is, well, what's the answer for these areas that may be too expensive for fiber to the premise? There will be some areas that are just very, like I mentioned, that's $400,000 a mile construction costs. Some of those are difficult questions, and there are other tools in the toolbox when it comes to wireless and stuff, but the problem you run into is 2 main issues. One is oftentimes these areas, you look in the mountains of California or Colorado or places like that, it's terrible wireless as well, because it's mountains. The terrain is not very good for wireless, and they've got 150-foot pine trees, so it's not very good for low Earth orbiting satellites either. So we will have to come up with some sort of a solution for these areas that are too expensive. But the second thing I will mention is, I've written some white papers on this as well, is when you look over the long term, oftentimes fiber to the premise ends up becoming the least expensive because of the long life of fiber. So you've got to keep that in mind. Oftentimes the initial CapEx is cheaper for a wireless or some other technology, but when you look over the long term of the life of the asset, oftentimes fiber becomes less expensive. because you don't have to replace it nearly as often. The next question is, how can we make this type of investment without disrupting competition? And there's always a concern where when the government gets involved, this much money is falling from the sky, that you're going to upset the competitive landscape because now you're funding a competitor. The reality is, though, the reason these places are in BEAD is nobody's serving them today. If somebody was offering adequate broadband, if there is a good competitor there, then it won't be part of the BEAD. So I don't think we're going to disrupt competition. Most all of these areas, there's no business case for somebody to build broadband in these areas without some sort of external support. And that's really what the BEAD is trying to accomplish. Last week, like I mentioned, Mr. Chambers claimed that the cost of bringing fiber to rural America is only $2,000 to $2,500 per location. What do you make of that? One thing to keep in mind, I believe he was probably talking about $2,000, $2,500 of support. So maybe he's thinking it's $5,000. I don't know. But the reality is, his numbers are much less than what we've experienced when we've been building out these broadband areas. One thing to keep in mind too is when we look at, we have an idea that we're going to go out and solve the problem with this BEAD. Not only is it not enough, but you've also got to think that there's operational expenses, there's replacement costs and things like that that we're all completely ignoring. I think it's not even enough to build the network initially, but there's really no money to make sure that it's going to be ongoing. There's also, you've got to consider that there's places that can get 100 by 20 today that won't be part of the BEAD, because let's say there's a wireless WISP that can do 100 by 20. 5 years from now or 10 years from now, that's going to seem like dial-up. And we're going to have to go back and solve those problems too, because now we had a technology that maybe was adequate today. It's not going to be adequate 10 years from now. When I started Vantage Point 20 years ago, I was showing slides that said we need to get 1 meg by 2005. And I had people arguing with me saying, why on earth do we need a meg? It's going to be the same way 5 or 10 years from now. We're going to have to go back and address the areas that BEAD doesn't address. Next bullet. Finally, why is there so much disagreement regarding whether existing BEAD funds will meet the need? I think it's really key. I'm not going to massage my numbers to come up with some sort of to influence the policymakers one way or the other. My purpose of the white paper was really to say, how much do I think it's going to cost? I think policymakers appreciate having honest and accurate answers to make the best policy. And I think a lot of people that are writing, like they're university folks or consultants that never constructed networks like this. We do a lot of this construction, so we have a pretty good handle on what it's going to cost. But I think we have lots of people weighing in that probably don't know all the nuances of building broadband in rural areas. I think that's my last slide, Gary.
All right. Well, Larry, as always, you provide so much great expertise, and I think Jonathan's concern, and Jonathan's very animated about this, but is that when you start to create all this fear, uncertainty, doubt over whether BEAD can support what we're trying to do, then it drives policymakers to make bad decisions, is what he's concerned about. He said he saw that at the FCC. We could have, if we had done fiber from the beginning, we would have, we wouldn't have been subsidizing the same areas over and over and over again. Was what we saw with like the CAF program. So Cartesian Monday, they put out their cost estimate.
Let me respond to that, just because of the fact that I don't think it's also a good strategy to go in with false information to the policymakers to manipulate them to get some sort of an outcome that you want. I think the best solution is to give them accurate information so we can have the best policy.
Yeah, I don't think, Jonathan's putting together his expertise and accuracy. So Cartesian on Monday, they issued a statement on their cost estimate, and they found that that they thought your estimates were overstated by the unserved and underserved locations by 4.2 times. And also you thought your fiber cost by location was 2 times more costly. And so they thought that you overstated everything, your total cost by 8.4 times. And if they took the midpoint of your study at $437.5 billion to serve all unserved and underserved locations, and you divide that by the overstatement of 4.8 times, they came up with about $52 billion, which is consistent with other studies and government estimates for the BEAD program. And just kind of to drill in there, so basically the reason they thought that your overstatements on the unserved is the most recent 477 data had 3.3 million, and then you had also agreed with their estimates they used with Georgia 3x, and so that came up about 9.9 million unserved locations. And then they subtracted out the locations eligible for other subsidies, so $1.5 million from RDOF, excluding the defaults, 2.5 million from the ARPA and CARES and so forth. So that kind of came down to 5.9 locations unserved, and then they saw that you had assumed 27.5 underserved locations, and basically their estimates of that was overstated by 4.2 times based on the FCC data and their adjustments. Anyway,
Okay.
Rather than kind of getting into those details, I mean, do you feel that there's some room that you guys could be overstated by, 8 times too much?
Well, keep in mind, Cartesian, they said $3.3 million in its or 3.3 million locations in this last report. Their report last year was 11 million. I don't know how they get from 11 million to 3 million. That puzzles me a little bit. The other thing in this recent report, they completely ignored any locations for the underserved in the partially served census blocks. They just ignored those entirely. I believe that in those 3.3 million locations, they came up with the only way they could get down to a number like that is including people like SpaceX and LTD that have already been thrown out, that they were reducing the FCC numbers by. So I don't, they just published it 2 days ago. My initial scan is I think there's some problems with their analysis as well. But one thing I will say, Gary, there are some things I will admit in my analysis, it was based on June 2020 data. There has been broadband build out since then, so my numbers could potentially be lower. But I will also say that there's other factors that could, put upward pressure. These recent inflationary factors that I never accounted for, and things like that. I think there's things in my analysis if it were to, and we'll be able to true some of this up once we get the broadband data collection numbers. I think we're going to start being able to true up the actual location count. And maybe I could go back and apply some realistic construction costs to those. But I think we're a few months away from being able to see who's right on those numbers. I think my numbers on the locations might be a little bit high. I think my numbers on the cost per location might be a little bit low.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it really, I mean, the way I look at BEAD, it's really the administration's statement that this is important and we need to connect every American with fiber. And, I think BEAD, whatever the amount is, it gets us over the tipping point, because we've seen not only there's over $100 billion when you add in ARPA and coronavirus capital projects and RDOF and Reconnect and so forth. You also see private investment. So you've seen, all the tier 1s and tier 2s and, putting in a lot of private capital. The cable companies are building out fiber like crazy. So there's, an equal match on that. We also saw with the recent middle mile, so the NTI middle mile, it was $1 billion. We had $5.5 billion. And everybody I've talked to, on average, they've been looking at matches somewhere between 40 and 45% match on that middle mile. And so, there is going to be significant match on some of this. Some that's going to be very difficult to match, but others, I think we'll see, in order to be very competitive, there'll be a pretty large match. So
yeah, but
I think that
even in that Cartesian report, Gary, the they went through the analysis and said that maybe we'll get around $2,500 or something per location match to be able to get a reasonable return on your investment. If I'm talking about 15,000 a location, if you subtract the 2,500, which would be a reasonable match that maybe an investment person would put in there, we're still talking about a lot of support. It still might be $12,000 of support needed. But I think from a policy perspective, one of the worst things for policymakers to think is, I'm going to throw this BEAD money out there and it's solving the problem. I'm going to walk away after that. Because the reality is there's still a lot of areas I think that are going to be unserved or underserved once the BEAD is done. I think they're forgetting about these high operational costs that are prevalent in these very rural areas that still need some sort of ongoing support. And I do think it doesn't address all of the ongoing CapEx replacement costs. Fiber doesn't last forever either. And eventually that's going to have to be replaced. Electronics doesn't last forever. That's going to have to be replaced.
Well, we have so many great questions, and I wish we had booked an hour for this because this was such an interesting conversation. And, so one thing I think that we all agree on, whether it's you, Jonathan, Fiber Broadband Association, is the investment in fiber is going to yield the best return.
Long term, it's the best economically, and it gives you the best broadband. It's very clearly the best way to invest your money.
And I think that, we all agree that we're putting out a tremendous amount of money forward to try to connect as many people as possible. So hopefully we'll get the job done, or if not, we're going to be really close and be able to at least be able to hump to be able to finish the job with whatever it takes. With that, Larry, hopefully you can address some of these online, all the questions. I'll send you all the questions here because there's so many great questions. Okay. It's just a pleasure to have you as always, Larry. Thanks for all your contributions to our industry in rural America and Uganda as well. So thanks, Larry.
All right, thanks, Gary.
I want to thank everybody for joining us. I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We'll be discussing commitment to serve yields high, sky high NPS with Paul Croonins, the CEO of i3 Broadband. So we'll see you guys next Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.